I'd like to welcome you back to our walk through Romans. Let me just remind you this is a walk and not a run. We're walking verse by verse through the book of Romans. Today we're in Romans, the 11th chapter, and we're going to start with verse number 16. Now, the Apostle Paul is talking, and he's talking about the remnant of Israel. I don't believe all of Israel is going to be saved because of what the Apostle Paul has said. And he says in verse number 14 to save some of them. Now, I don't believe at this time that all of Israel is going to be saved. But I believe that there's going to be a resurrection of Israel. I believe that wholeheartedly. There's coming a move of God upon the nation of Israel. And we're going to talk about that some today. Verse number 16 of Romans 11 says this: if the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches also. What's the Apostle Paul saying? He's saying that Israel is holy, set apart for God. But then he's saying that the lump is also holy. Now, we need to understand this lump. You know, sometimes we just read over things and we don't really understand. The lump that the Apostle Paul is talking about is something that needs to break and needs to be dissolved by kneading. You know, when you make a loaf of bread, what do? You put yeast in it. But if you just let that lump of yeast just sit there in that dough, you know what? It's not going to do any good at all. It's just going to sit there. What you need to do is you need to begin to knead that bread. Now, I remember my mother doing it by hand. Now we have machines to do it. But kneading that dough, and her hands were so strong, and she would take that dough and she would pull it, and that's exactly what God is doing with the Gentiles. He is breaking that lump, and he's spreading it into this dough called Israel. And he's bringing Israel back to himself. And then he ends verse number 16 by saying there, if the root is holy, if the root's set apart, who is the root? Israel. Then the branches also. Now let's move on to verse number 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partakers with them of the rich root of the olive tree. What's the Apostle Paul saying? The Apostle Paul is saying that the branches. Now, what are the branches? The branches are the dead parts of Judaism. Do you understand? And again, I don't believe that every Jewish person who's ever born is going to be in heaven. Why? Because the only way you get to heaven is by accepting the grace of God, by faith. And I believe that there's been branches of Judaism that have been broken off. But what God has done is God has taken the branches that were broken off, and he's taken a wild olive branch. And what did he do? He grafted it in amongst the Jewish people. You know, we Gentiles, or I should say us Gentiles, you know what? We are grafted into Israel. That's why we need to look at Israel with a great deal of respect. We are grafted into them. Now, when a branch is grafted in, what happens? That branch begins to take on the nature of the roots, the nature of the tree that it's grafted into. It's cultured in to the roots of that tree. And we as Gentiles, we have been allowed to become part of a spiritual Israel, God's chosen people, God's family. And we were grafted in among them and became partakers with them of the rich root. What are we? We're receiving through that root of Judaism. We are receiving all the nutrients. That's why it's so important that believers are looking at the Old Testament, because the Old Testament will tell us about what are the blessings of Abraham. The Old Testament reveals the promises that we believe in. Do you know that all the promises of the New Testament are based upon Old Testament prophecies and Old Testament promises that God gave to Israel? Promises for healing, for prosperity, for peace, for anything. It's based upon our receiving what God spoke to Israel. Now, verse number 18, do not be arrogant towards the branches. And if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the roots, but the root supports you. Don't be arrogant, Gentiles, towards the Jewish people. Don't boast against them. Don't speak against them. You as a believer should never speak against the Jewish people. Do you understand? I can't say that plain enough. You should never speak against the Jewish people. The word arrogant actually means to boast or to speak against something. And the Apostle Paul says, do not be arrogant towards the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the roots, but the roots support you. You are speaking against something that's the very root of your relationship with God. Verse number 19. And you will say then, branches were broken off so that I may be grafted in. Verse number 20, you're quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief. Why did God break off the branches? Because he decided he didn't love them anymore? No. They were broken off because they made a choice not to believe the promises of God. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand by your faith. The only thing that causes us to stand is our faith. Do not be conceited, but fearful. Don't be conceited. Don't be proud, but act in fear. And it goes on, verse number 21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. If God did not spare the natural branches, he won't spare us. We need to stay in faith. Faith activates the grace of God. Stay in faith today. Thank you for watching.